If you're enjoying the podcast, consider leaving us a review or supporting the show on Patreon. You can find more information on our website at unlivablecultures.wordpress.com, and we're also on Twitter at unlivablepod. Feel free to also just hang out with us for these podcast episodes and then go on with your day.
This is a real opportunity for a labor movement to make actual change if there was some effort to devote attention and investment into this, but there isn't any kind of concerted effort or body that has the traction to be doing this at a large scale, and all of us just running amok on our own isn't solving the systemic problem.
Welcome to Unlivable Cultures. This is the podcast with no labor union and where we all work too much.
Where we're talking about Starbucks inspiring and nurturing the destruction of the human spirit, which is their motto is like, to inspire and nurture the human spirit. So
I didn't know that. That's a good
yeah,
one.
I'm funny.
Who knew? Anyway, my name is Cody Scahan and I'm joined by my co-hosts.
Hi, I'm Julia Coverdale, and I use they, them pronouns also. And we're also joined by...
And my name is Clayton Gerard. My pronouns are he, him.
And my pronouns are also he, him. On today's podcast, we are talking about unions, Twitter, Starbucks. So we thought it would make sense to start off with like a kind of brief definition of unions, just kind of giving some contextualization for the episode and sort of also a little bit maybe of the history of labor unions in the US and why like business owners and corporations are such against unions. Kind of where I'm getting this is from the rise and fall of labor unions in the US from the 1830s until 2012, but mostly the 1930s to 1980s. This is by G. William Domhoff, who is a professor in sociology at the University of California at Santa Cruz. So basically, labor unions are when workers form together and have a organization that represents them to, on their behalf, negotiate for contracts, better wages, better benefits. Domhoff talks about labor unions as being like a defensive mechanism primarily for protecting rights. That's kind of how they initially started. But they also used sort of offensively, you could say, in terms of gaining and building rights for workers. So labor unions can be from single institutions like at one workplace, like Starbucks, for example. And then there are some labor unions that incorporate entire industries. So there's like rail worker unions, there's teacher unions, there's these sort of more national or even occasionally international unions to protect workers' rights collectively. And so they have different sort of goals and outcomes of protecting wages and rights, and they have different strategies and techniques and levels of power available to them depending on how many people are in the union, exactly what type of industry it is, what kind of work they're interested in and fighting for. So
it is worth mentioning that like going back to like even Marx and taking a very like rudimentary approach to it, capitalism exists based on exploitation. And so in order for capitalists to be profitable, they have to exploit the working people. So that's basically the impetus of where this all begins. In order for our economic system to work, people have to be exploited. People have to be profited over. And if you're looking at like the 1800s, the 1900s, the contrast between like the capitalist and the working class is very stark. You see people that are being extraordinarily exploited based on our standards today of the working conditions that they're in, the constant like having to work. The 8-hour workday is not an old phenomena. Like this is something that was within like the past 100 years or so because of the awful exploitation that existed. So just kind of contextualizing that, and the need for unions was in a lot of ways to protect people from the exploitation of capitalists and the ways that people were just like brutally trying to profit off of people no matter what. which still exists today, just in more insidious ways.
Yeah, that's great. And I think this outlines a really interesting point I wanted to make, because bringing up Marx and thinkers like this, it's kind of clear to see how unions are inherently working. There's sort of this tool that you can use to work within the capitalist system to protect workers from the drive for profitability, things like this. This is why employers hate unions. But this is kind of how labor unions serve this function of being sort of like a mini sort of step towards socialism, almost, in a way, because it's about protecting the workers, it's protecting the working class, it's protecting labor, these things, which completely goes against the capitalist system, which is also why corporations and business owners and the government is helping them, working alongside and helping these capitalists exploit their workers, are so afraid of unions, especially when they grow big. They can generate like cross-union solidarity or cross-class and cross-racial boundary solidarity, because that's a big threat to capitalism and business as usual sort of market economy stuff.
I really want to highlight that race piece, especially looking at it from an intersectional lens of like, we exist in a settler colonial nation that is built on white supremacy, and that's baked into the structures that we have today, the economic structures and social structures. And so like unionizing and labor unions and labor movements are not siloed from racial struggles or other struggles that are happening. Like even prominent African American and Black thinkers and activists like Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., these people were huge advocates of unions and unionizing and labor movements because of the recognition that marginalized communities couldn't reach equality without having the material and economic resources to do so. Kind of also want to recognize the multi-pronged forces that are involved in this struggle. To quote from a piece called A Brief History of Labor, Race, and Solidarity from the Labor Commission on Racial and Economic Justice, I thought they summarized really well. They say, starting with Richard Nixon and extending to Donald Trump, conservative politicians wrote a new playbook: activate racial fears while lifting up white people as the, quote, silent majority, unquote, or real Americans, people who, quote, like to play by the rules, while publicly displaying empathy for the middle class or working people. Instruct your political appointees to dismantle labor protections, restrict union activities, and undermine civil rights protections. So in these different spheres of like racial equality and poverty and class struggles, these are all intersecting in various ways and looking at politics and how politicians, specifically from like conservative sides of the political spectrum, deal with worker unions and labor protections, mirrors how we're talking about, citizenship and who Americans are and what is expected of an American, and what, all basically pursuing the American dream, who gets to do so and by what mechanisms.
Yeah. What really struck me when I was reading from that piece, just kind of broadly, is the beginning of labor and sort of after slavery was ended and more Black workers started entering the workforce. Of course, there was the sharecropping and all of the disingenuous techniques used in the South to continue to sort of like basically perpetuate slavery, if not in name. And then like the government eventually just kind of pulled out and backed out and said, okay, we're not going to regulate the South and the desegregation. We're just going to let it go as it will, which led to lots and lots of violence. But there was still racial conflicts in the workplace. Like when white workers would go on strike, then they would bring in Black workers to replace them because presumably they were cheaper and willing to work. And then that angered the white workers, and it led to lots of conflicts between white workers and Black workers. What I thought was really striking is though, like eventually over time, the solidarity was kind of built between these, like after lots of violence and lots of, kinks in the process and whatever. It took a while, but eventually there was cross-racial solidarity based on labor, the sort of realization of collectivity and like the racial solidarity is stronger, will help both of our sides more through working together in unions rather than remaining separate. although there are still, of course, race issues and race disparities in the workplace today and unions. I don't know the details of that, but it certainly can be a very powerful technique for overcoming the corporations and the government who encourage segregation based on race or differential treatment and differential pay based on race. So labor unions can be, as Clayton was outlining, a very strong force for opposing that.
And I mean, one of those details that you mentioned is really interesting looking at a little bit more granularly, because thinking of like the Great Migration, as it's sometimes called, of Black people and African Americans that moved from the South to the North, labor unions and labor strikes were a huge part of that. And it was really interesting as I was reading more about it and trying to go through different details. The Great Migration is usually attributed to starting around like the early 1910s on for the next couple decades. But like late 1800s to early 1900s, there were a lot of issues around immigration, especially like in the North. A lot of the laborers who worked in warehouses and factories and different industrial centers in the North were immigrants from Europe. So, like Irish immigrants. And of course, there's a whole lot of other issues going around with like religion and those different kinds of prejudice and discrimination. But during that time period with immigration in the second half of the 19th century, relations between America and Europe were kind of straining, and these populations that were typically used to kind of build the workforce in these industries were diminishing. And that's when a lot of companies decided to open up the workforce and allow like Black people to come in and work. So not only do you have worker protection tensions boiling and you've got more people protesting and striking and trying to form unions and get a power and accountability for the companies that they work for, but you've also got immigration tensions arising. So fewer people are immigrating and you're having a harder time building your workforce. And then they allowed, Black people to start working at their places, which directly coincides with a lot of reconstruction that was happening in the South and the explosion of lynchings, which was just a really awful reality for Black people in the South and families. And so there were a lot of forces of racism that people were fleeing, but there was also this opening up of opportunity or supposed opportunity in the North for workers to join different industries. But at that time, it's almost like our capitalist system somehow figures out how to sustain itself and morphs to exploit the racial tensions that exist. So not only are you having workers fighting against the companies that employ them for trying to fight for livable wages and livable conditions, but then they're turning and facing Black people that are coming into the workforce as their enemies instead. And so the capitalists and the companies that they work for are allowed to have a little bit more space to, continue their exploitation and everything else. So just thinking of that, and then also it does warrant mentioning ability, because at this time, especially with immigration, ability and disability was a huge issue. In the West of like California and those areas, there were a lot of immigrants from China and regions surrounding, or what we consider the global East, to come. They have to basically prove to be physically fit enough to work and have manual jobs. So they had a bunch of like arbitrary tests of like measuring the circumference of people's heads and seeing if they like have good enough posture or something to determine if they are able-bodied enough to become an American citizen. And, those kinds of racial stereotypes was happening on both sides of the country to filter people that were trying to immigrate to America too. So that's just yet another complication and issue of what was going on at this time that kind of primed what we were seeing with labor unions and the workforce and the strife that was going on.
Right. I think what really sticks out to me too is what you mentioned earlier about sort of the adaptability of capitalism. It feels like this is the history of labor unions, and it's been kind of, at one hand, remarkably quick in the U.S., but considering its young age, it's perhaps not so surprising, but compared to other countries, but it still seems quite remarkable how capitalism has adapted. And basically, it seems a lot of the struggles and things that have been won by the workplace and by workers has been only because capitalism has essentially at some point ceded to it and said, okay, fine. And a lot of these things, it's like capitalism does find a way to make it still strike it to its benefit. And that's to say that that's why labor unions are so important, because they're one of the few things that can really like scare capitalism and really like drive it up the wall. Because, and this is kind of out of context of what we're talking about right now, but I've been coming across these articles recently and they just drive me crazy. But they talk about it, one article was about this woman who had been constantly like applying for promotion in her job and was constantly denied and denied. And so instead of like, just quitting or doing something, she decided to look for other jobs. And she instantly found a job that paid her like $15,000 more a year or something like that. Basically gave her the position she wanted. But that's basically what a market economy is. Like, you just find a new job because your current job isn't giving you enough money, so you find someone that will pay higher. That's capitalism. So power to those people, like, cool, you're making more money. But I think a much more stronger way of perhaps trying to do this was either join a union or try to form a union. And yes, this is a lot of work, and I don't want to individualize the responsibility. But this is why labor unions are so important, because it's about collectively everybody in her position, so hopefully, would get a raise. The workplace employment practices would be changed to not be like, for whatever reason, I didn't read the article, but perhaps, questions of sexism might have been involved, questions of racial stereotypes might have been involved. I'm not sure. But labor unions, by working within a labor union, it's about improving relations and the situation for everybody, rather than kind of just also going into this capitalist individualism system of using the market to say, okay, I'm going to find a job that pays higher because this one's not giving me enough money. Presumably, the next person that's in her position might get stuck in the same spot and be constantly asking for promotion, but never get the deserved promotion.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that, but at the same time, like, there's a lot of issues there, which you have to do what you have to do to live your life and, have a livable wage and provide for yourself and the ones around you. And also, maybe the working conditions there were really awful and it wasn't entirely about that, or maybe there weren't growth opportunities or all this other stuff. So I do agree with what you're saying, especially with like the individual responsibility of we can't sit here and put the onus on individuals to change the system instead of actually addressing the system itself. Because, I mean, this is a lot of the issue that we've seen the past couple of years with the quote unquote Great Resignation, where a lot of people are leaving their jobs for a myriad of reasons, whether it be the need or the desire to work from home, which is now an option that like wasn't nearly as often considered an option by companies, or benefits like insurance. You've got the commutes that you have, you've got life circumstances that change. I mean, there's so many different things that involve the work that you're doing and your position. But yeah, basically make looking at individual circumstances irrelevant, and it just obscures any of that micro level thinking when you see how complicated the situation is. These things almost have to be addressed at a systemic level. And there is power in, creating a collective to go and work with a union or try to start a union or try to create some body of accountability or a way to leverage power. But at the same time, unions aren't perfect. A lot of unions have some real issues as well. And then also, unions can put you in more tenuous positions. Obviously, a lot of unions have like annual dues, or they take a certain amount of your salary and pay, or you don't get the same amount of benefits. So like, I know for Starbucks, one of the big issues there were people lost a lot of benefits when they joined a union, or if their store unionized, they weren't then able to, the baristas weren't able to transfer to another store, or it really complicated their ability to get health insurance or their ability to have a 401k. Like, all those things, Starbucks, the company itself, basically said, well, if you're going to unionize, then you don't have access to these benefits, because we're not going to try to work with a unionized body and sort out those kinks. So if you unionize, you're basically cutting yourself from all these other things. So all that to say that situations are so complex and complicated that unless you're looking at this from a systemic vantage point, then, you know, things fall into irrelevancy
Right.
very quickly.
I do think it is important to note, though, like, what are problems within unions themselves, like the dues and things that you mentioned, versus what is the problem with the systems of power and like businesses reacting. It is not necessarily inherently the union's fault that Starbucks is rolling back all of these benefits.
Oh yeah, definitely not the Starbucks union's
Yeah.
fault. Like, this is a Starbucks thing.
Yeah. So I think it's just important to remember both things, but I think it's important to also be critical of unions as well, because I think in many cases there is more that unions could be doing. There are just some things that could be better, like maybe not requiring people to pay dues.
Yeah, I mean, like, unions are a hierarchy. They're an institutional body. Like, there's bureaucracy and politics involved. They're never going to be perfect. And so I'm not excusing them in any way. But the way that I kind of consider them is like some version of a quote unquote outside body that can help hold companies accountable to their employees. But in doing some research for this episode, I was looking at statistics and research done by Gallup about unions and perceptions around unions. And it's really interesting. So, like, Ben Weigert, who's the director of research and strategy for workplace management at Gallup, was talking about how there has been a really significant increase in support for unions, not just in the past couple of years, but going back to around like 2015, 2017-ish. And it's also interesting because like this is observed from both sides of the political spectrum. So usually there's more approval of unions and labor movements from people on the left, so like the Democratic Party and more liberal stances, but there also has been a rise in acceptance for Republican adjacent people in their politics. So Weigert said that typically for the GOP, it's around the mid 40 percentile of support for unions. So like the 45, 42, 47-ish of people who identify as Republicans and are more GOP adjacent are sympathetic to unions, but that apparently has bumped to 56% this year. So in 2021, it was at 48%. 2022, it jumped to 56%. But the paradox here is that while there is growing support for unionization and unions, it doesn't actually track with the people who are joining unions. So while there is a lot more support, people don't seem to be joining unions at the same level of excitement or enthusiasm, I guess. So one of the observations for that difference was just the fact that having union representation and advocacy for like better pay and benefits is really important. And that's one reason people join unions. It doesn't always translate into a better experience at work for people that actually work there in their day-to-day lives. So joining a union can actually hurt someone's standing in the company or opportunities, or it just like ends up being more trouble than it's worth, or, you know, paying the dues isn't worth the fact that it doesn't really have any bearing on your day-to-day life. So there's that disconnect where we see people are more willing to support unions, but at the same time, there doesn't seem to be as much commitment to unions from people that actually have the ability or option to unionize, which is very interesting thinking of like cases like Starbucks, where unionizing puts you into a very precarious position and has become a very controversial thing throughout the US. People are really advocating hard to join unions and for Starbucks stores to unionize, and it really hurts their employment or, you know, the risk for retaliation or something like that.
And just add on to a lot of the shortcomings of unions that we've been talking about. It would be really interesting to see, I think, more education about unions. We do learn a little bit, at least I did, learned a little bit about the history of unions and labor strikes, But I feel like on the practical side of it, it was obvious, like very devoid, which makes sense from an institutional ideological perspective why they wouldn't teach us. But unions, for example, are so important for teachers, especially in the US, because of how little they're paid and how much power they need to like actually get a reasonable wage and school supplies for the classroom, and with the increasing attacks on education funding in different places in the US.
I mean, it's not only that. I have friends that are teachers, and like, if you have a parent with really powerful connections in tiny, micro level local politics without some kind of protection, you get stuff where it just kind of implodes. That could literally cost them their job.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of interesting because that kind of also points to the problem of it's harder to have a local union, like to have such a small union. They have less power because they have less people. And so some of these individual connections to stronger powers can uphold, which one of the problems with unions too is like their differing level of strength. And that's based on their size. So kind of what you were alluding to earlier with, sometimes joining a union can make your life worse. Sometimes companies single you out because you join a union. I mean, this is because legislation about labor protection and joining unions isn't nearly as strong as it should be. But it's also about coverage because unions thrive on having larger segments of any population. It's kind of like almost herd immunity. And as you alluded to earlier as well, like labor unions are very hierarchical. They can have different contract levels essentially within the same workplace or within the same industry. So like, people who are would be classified in sort of a trade, for example. There's like the apprenticeship position, which you basically get the brunt of the problems of being in a union. And then, you slowly move your way up. And by the time you actually get to I believe it's called like master level in like a trade union, for example, and then you're riding high. You get your retirement benefits. Typically, you get very good benefits and well paid off. And it's definitely nice to be a union for them. But not only that, labor unions can be kind of at times straight up exploitative. And this can often be stemming from having like bad representatives and sort of a like short circuiting of the democratic principles that are supposed to underride unions, about people within unions voting for their representatives and having strong representatives that actually respect their interests and don't fold to maybe perhaps some lobbying or under the table payments or to their own interests as either workers also in the union but higher level or as a completely different aspect of society. So
Shall we get into the fun part?
yeah.
I would like to.
I researched Southwest, we got Starbucks, we got Twitter, Southwest Airlines. I mean, because of the whole debacle around their meltdown this holiday season. Yeah, those were the main three that I researched, but I am more than happy to talk about others.
Yeah, I would vote for Twitter at least first, and then maybe, or we could start with Amazon because Julia mentioned they wanted to talk about that one. So
It's just brief. I just know that Amazon has been pretty explicitly anti-unionizing, which for, like a company that very famously has like terrible labor practices, and also like Amazon warehouses, there's a large collective of laborers there, like there has to be. And so I think that those places can really have powerful unions, but of course there's a reason that Amazon doesn't want them to unionize.
Which the crux of it is, if you just treat people better,
Yeah.
give them a little more money, give them a better experience, you wouldn't have the same headache that you have now, except you're, having to go fight this other war because you're not willing to treat people like humans. But
Yeah.
I digress.
I think there's a combination of pushing and pulling factors here because, for example, all warehouse workers were given extra pay for Fridays, for showing up on Fridays, because Amazon struggled to bring in bodies on Fridays. So I think, for one, they sort of thrive on this sort of gig economy kind of flexible labor, like their delivery drivers, especially, who are just people in their own personal vehicles delivering packages, and being able to bring in workers with temporarily sign-on bonuses and bonuses around holidays and things like this to bring in work for peak seasons, because Amazon, as a company that sells goods, especially around holidays and things like that. They have a peak season, and so after that, they have more workers than they need, and so you get worse conditions, more layoffs, things like this. So they kind of thrive a little bit also on this gig economy of flexible labor and things like that. So it's kind of like a combination of how much would it actually benefit them in some regards to improve conditions over the long term. There's definitely these short time periods where it would help. There's also in the capitalist system, exploitative system, long time periods where it wouldn't help as well.
Yeah, I mean, you bring that up, and it reminds me of my days working in the FedEx warehouse. I don't know why I said that with like a southern draw, like my days on the farm. But I mean, that is a point because it's like we had 3.5 hour shifts and you could work like multiple shifts in the day. So you technically got a 30-minute lunch break, but it's not a lunch break if you're working 2 shifts. Or like if you only work 3.5 hours, you don't have to have a 10-minute break because the law in Kansas is for every 4 hours, you have to have a 10-minute break. So if you're only working people for 3.5 hours, then you don't have to give them a break. But at the same time, if they're too busy, they'll end up working the 4 hours, but they're not scheduled the 4 hours. So that's where things start to fall through the cracks. And then you have people working double shifts. There were times where I worked 8 hours straight with no breaks because my 3.5 hour shift went long and then my 4 hour shift started. And then, you had to go to the other end of the warehouse to go to the bathroom, and you had to sign this clipboard with your name and the time that you're going to the bathroom. And it's just this huge inconvenience to even go to the bathroom, especially if you only have a 3.5 hour shift. So like just those different little things where companies couldn't get away with those little tiny details if there were more bodies of accountability for employees to leverage. Yeah. Especially thinking of like warehouses and peak seasons and the rises and falls in those situations. If you're treating people the ways that I think workers deserve to be treated, then you're obviously going to have shortfalls when you're looking at peak seasons or little tiny ways to get around different regulations and labor laws.
Yeah, they definitely make it as hard as you can to either as a single individual to kind of assert your benefits or join a union. I'm right now reading a Jacobin article called Here's How We Beat Amazon. And this is about successful union organizing in an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island. And the interviewer they're talking about is just describing the sacrifices they had to make to actually unionize. Like instead of spending their time off around their kid, they would go back on their time off into the warehouse and just be there, talk to people, educate them, and especially educate them about the union busting meetings that were being held at the Amazon warehouse, where they would actually take employees and say, okay, you're going to come to this union busting, like anti-union educational seminar for a while, which reminds me of this other Jacobin article I was reading. It was about the UK, where the legislation is trying to pass a law that would basically in the UK, striking is not a protected right, but it's workers are protected from being sued for the loss of profit that companies suffered during strikes. And so they're trying to suppress that and take it away. So make it so corporations and companies can actually sue individuals and corporations for the lost profits accrued during strikes, which makes people even less likely to join a strike, to join a union. So this article was called Mike Lynch, the UK's proposed anti-union laws are a suppression of our human rights, which is an interview with Mike Lynch, who is a union organizer for the train union basically in the UK. So it's pretty interesting to see that even in the UK,
There's actually problems in the UK.
yeah. This is just my basic impression. And I think that's the thing though, because we don't have so much actual education and I think we're not taught about union organizing, and we are a little bit about the history, as I said earlier, but it's not like you're given a pamphlet about your workers' rights and all of this. So it's like a lot of it does feel like people are working off their intuitions and impressions. And that's why education, I think, is so important.
Talking about union busting.
Good transition.
Oh yeah, I've been practicing. Oh my gosh, Starbucks. There's so much with Starbucks. I almost don't know where to start. And full disclaimer, I worked at Starbucks for like 4.5 years.
Damn, 4.5 years. I didn't realize.
Yeah.
Wow.
I had to pay for college and living somehow.
4.5 years
So-
you'll never get back.
I mean, granted, it was okay for the first like 3.5 years, and then it all hit the fan, which, funny enough, which is not funny, but I feel like I was kind of a little canary in the coal mine for the district that I was in, because like a month before I left, I was on the phone with the district manager, like, you need to deal with this. This is really effed up, because I mean, it was a whole thing. Oh my gosh, there's so much to say. And then all of a sudden, 3 months later, we're seeing in the news that 2 different stores in the Kansas City area are trying to unionize and blah, 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 blah. And the vindication I felt. This is what's been happening for a long time. All this stuff has been brewing and bubbling up, and we're now just starting to see that it's at a boiling point. But I mean, it was really messed up. And reading about stuff that's happened, I think it was in South Carolina where a Starbucks manager called the police on their union employees who was trying to negotiate with them, and told the police that they were being harassed and wanted to like press charges. So the entire story is basically that the group of union workers, which was like 11 of them, were sitting down with their manager trying to talk through some issues, and then the manager just got up and walked away, called upper levels of Starbucks management, who then instructed her to call the cops since she felt so threatened and unsafe. So she like pushes past the barista, goes outside, calls the cops. A couple days later, the cops come in and press charges against the union employees, saying that the store manager brought charges of assault and kidnapping, and the police were investigating those charges. And then Starbucks, made an announcement or whatever, like, we stand by our manager, and blah, 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 blah. And these people weren't acting all right. But then, of course, a video surfaced on TikTok of the incident of the union employees or baristas not being anywhere near the manager, like closer than 5 or 10 feet. And the manager just walked out of the building. And then the cops saw that and looked at the other reports and were basically like, yeah, all that was fabricated and those were false allegations. There's nothing to charge the employees with. Yet, Starbucks still stands by the manager's claims, and the baristas, the partners, which is Starbucks language for employees, were put on leave with pay and weren't allowed to walk into any Starbucks premises or be on any Starbucks property during the time of the investigation. And then when they actually were allowed back, I think at least 4 of them were fired for what were cited as other incidents. So these baristas in South Carolina are now trying to sue Starbucks and the manager for falsifying these allegations and disseminating these accusations that they knew were to be false. In another store, I think it was in Virginia, one manager who had since left testified during a hearing for National Labor Relations Board that he had been instructed by the district managers to basically target employees that were trying to unionize and like be hyper vigilant of any policy that they might break, or in one instance to go back through a employee's files for like the previous months to find anything on them to bring up and kind of put corrective action on them. And this was specifically for any of the employees that were advocating to unionize. So these kinds of tactics have been going on for the months while Starbucks stores have been unionizing across the United States. The case for a lot of Starbucks now, they're hiring management that does not have experience working at Starbucks. In older times, so for example, I have a friend who trained me and we got along really well together when we worked. She's like almost 50 and she's worked at Starbucks for over 20 years now. So she has all those stories of like, back in my day, like it was more of like the coffee shop vibe that people know. Now Starbucks is basically just like fast food coffee. But back then there was more dedication to like the brand of Starbucks and the loyalty among customers and staff. Now, I mean, the district manager and a lot of the management that I had were outside hires. So you get people running a store who have never had experience actually working in a Starbucks store and knowing how everything works. So, like, I've had managers who literally couldn't even put orders in the computer. Like, you had to walk over there, stop making the drink, and put in the order for them, and then walk back and make the drink while they're managing the store because they don't know how to navigate. Like, they can't find the button for the order. And, like, that's kind of just a mundane issue. But when you get these people calling all the shots and, like, making decisions at the store level, at the district level, who don't have any understanding of what an experience of the barista is, then you start running into some issues. So especially like during the height of COVID, you have management making decisions about what's safe for baristas to do who have never experienced being a barista. And you're like experiencing a global pandemic, and your manager is telling you, oh, don't worry about this. That's not a big thing. And it's like, actually, you have no idea, what we have to do on a day-to-day basis. This isn't unique to Starbucks in any way. But I think this is a huge part of why we've seen an explosion of unionizing, is because like there were no levers of power for me to pull in order to get the sexual misconduct that was going on addressed. I talked to people, I talked to management, I did whatever I could, and nothing happened. And then the people that were suffering from that ended up just quitting because the issue wasn't going to be fixed. And then, the same thing with COVID. I had people on multiple occasions while I was a supervisor just quit because they had a 100.3 degree fever, and Starbucks only recognizes a 100.4 degree fever and over to be sick enough to not come to work. So like management was literally telling them, according to Starbucks policy, you're not sick enough to not show up to work. And it's like, we're in the middle of a fucking global pandemic, and my cousin or my brother or whoever else just tested positive for COVID, and I have a 100.3 degree fever, and you're telling me I still have to show up for work. Like, that happened on multiple occasions, and people just quit on the spot. Like, that's the kind of stuff where workers don't have the protection to actually make decisions that they consider to be safe for them or safe for customers or coworkers. And as I've been following stories of Starbucks stores unionizing and such, that's the kind of stuff that really tears down the trust for your employer. And what I was looking at from December 9th, 2022, 287 Starbucks stores across the US had voted to unionize. Interestingly, Starbucks upper echelons of management have had a lot of issues trying to union bust and do a lot of shady things to keep stores from unionizing. Howard Schultz, who was formerly the CEO, he stepped down a few years ago, and then in the midst of all this union busting crap show, he has taken over as CEO again in July of 2020, was saying that Democratic mayors and city councils have, quote, abdicated their responsibility, unquote, to fight crime and address mental illness in their communities, which is why they were having a whole host of store closures across the country, which were cited to be specifically for employee safety. Interestingly, where I worked at was like an hour or 45 minutes from like Kansas City metro area. There was a store in Kansas City metro, one of the first stores that tried to unionize in Kansas. And
Are you just doxing yourself?
What do you mean doxing?
This is where I worked.
I don't care. I'm like on the cusp of dropping names because I'm like,
Clayton's out for blood.
I don't like, if you don't have enough shame to not do it, then why should I be ashamed of saying that you did it? But we're sitting here talking about like the history of unions. We're talking about the broader cultural context and the cultural forces that are going into this. But this is the gritty day-to-day experience right now of people here in 2022, 2023 of unionizing and union busting, and having worked at Starbucks.
No, I love it.
Being close to many people that are still in this sphere. It's like, if we're going to talk about this, let's fucking talk about it. I mean, in Kansas City, it was a big deal because one of the Starbucks stores that we're trying to unionize like had a bunch of safety concerns that they brought to management multiple times. So for this particular example, one of them was because there was no parking lot for the store, so employees had to park in a parking garage like 2 blocks down. And Starbucks policy is that if you're working, you're not supposed to be outside alone in the dark. Like you need to have some companion with you, like some other employee with you, just to have that safety, I guess, or the idea of safety. But then you've got people that are walking downtown 2 or 3 blocks at 10 o'clock at night and aren't feeling safe, but they don't have a choice because like this is their job and they don't have any kind of mechanism or procedure to ensure their safety. If you've only got 3 people working, you can't spare a second employee to go work or to go walk the other employee down to the parking garage because you're not allowed to be in the store alone. So like, I mean, those are different things that you have to juggle with being a supervisor and such. And that was one of the big reasons why they worked to try to unionize, was because of these safety concerns that Starbucks wouldn't address. Fast forward 6 or 8 months, when the store took the union vote, it didn't pass. I think they were lacking like 1 vote, so the store ultimately didn't unionize. And then guess what happened? Starbucks management turned around and closed the store, citing safety concerns. So like this management wouldn't do anything for the safety concerns that they had, so the partners unionize. And then when the unionization isn't successful, Starbucks turns around and closes the store and is like, we encourage you to try to apply to other Starbucks or transfer to other Starbucks stores around the area. And it's like, you know, all of a sudden you have no job because of this. So like those are some of the issues that are really cropping up throughout the states.
Speaking of shit shows, should we move to Twitter? I was just going to say, I guess some of the abuses of power and kind of things you're detailing at Starbucks reminded me of the article we were reading about 2 weeks of chaos inside Elon Musk Twitter, takeover of Twitter from the New York Times, which was just chock full of really juicy details. Honestly, it was almost like watching like, what the hell is it called? Succession. Just, I don't know, being on the inside of this like internal sort of power politics and what happens with, especially with such an incompetent person taking over. To me, it was just crazy. So basically, just to give some context, some of the facts, so you can understand why I'm so interested and incensed at the same time. Elon Musk, essentially, after he took over Twitter, the next day, when he went into the headquarters and everything, he brought in his war team and was saying, okay, we're going to have to lay off a shit ton of people.
Don't you want to mention how he first walked into the building?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so he walked in carrying a sink and had it recorded and said, let that sink in, which
It's like
Hey,
I don't even know.
comedies,
a combination between Michael Scott and Donald Trump.
and also,
Yeah.
you know, when the ownership was first passed over to him, he also tweeted, "Comedy is now legal." Twitter.
Yeah.
I will remind everybody that comedy is only legal if you're not making fun of Elon Musk and Elon Musk's businesses and impacting his bottom line. Otherwise,
Yeah.
that is illegal comedy to him. But racism is legal, so
Literally like promoting fascism and everything. 100% legal, but yeah. Especially when you contextualize it just like, oh, I was just making a joke. Come on, like chill out. It's a joke, bro.
it was just a joke, and jokes are harmless.
My favorite is him saying that Apple doesn't have Twitter ads because it hates free speech now.
That
Seriously,
makes
like
no sense. But anyway,
companies don't have to advertise with your company.
This is
Yeah.
also
Like,
just how
it's not.
capitalism works. Like,
yeah, he literally, what was like related to ads, he's like was basically brought back political ads on Twitter, which is just like a shit show. Terrible. Like, that's only going to lead to more misinformation and, election meddling and good stuff, fun stuff that we love. Anyway, it was like he arrived at Twitter with his, sink in hand, of course, to make his very powerful entrance and say, yes, I have the sink. bow to me.
An entrance for the ages.
Yeah. And recorded it and uploaded it to Twitter, of course.
We are feeding his ego right now. We gotta stop doing that.
Yeah. Too much. Sorry.
I've got to stay on his good side.
Yeah. Oh, I don't want to be banned from Twitter. Yeah.
Who's to say where he's going to be 10 years from now? Like,
Yeah, true. You might.
if
Yeah,
I need to
that'd
have
be-
a seat on his spaceship to get to Mars.
But yes, walking in, sink in hand, assembles his war team, basically made up of his employees from other companies, and bringing his even people who worked for him at PayPal a million years ago before he sold PayPal, and was like, okay, we're gonna have to lay off a shit ton of people, and we're gonna have to do it quick, because on November 1st, he came in October 28th, and on November 1st there was due a payout of bonuses. And after a little bit like deliberating and time and everything, and his lawyers coming through the data, apparently it turned out that it wouldn't make sense to actually lay them off before November 1st, because then the amount of fees and litigation would be more expensive than it would cost if they just paid out the bonuses and then let people go, which is just, so generous of him, I think, to actually pay the bonuses to the people.
I mean, that's rationality at its best.
Exactly. It's economic rationality, capitalism just functioning to the T. And mind you, it I thought was really interesting too, is like there was already like internal disruptions, and they heard about the sort of some of the conversations happening in his war team. And eventually it came out that it was likely that he was trying to fire literally 3,738 workers could be laid off, which was about half the workforce at the time, which I believe was 7,000 or 7,500, one of those two. And the New York Times article describes scenes of like people dressing up for the Halloween party and trying to bring up this workplace fever and actually like, reinvigorate it again and make people not depressed. But there was literally tons of people crying because they're like, I'm about to get laid off. Very morbid, bleak picture.
Yeah, like people had no idea. And then one of the really disturbing pieces that was in that article was just that some people, their notification for getting laid off is them checking their email to see if they were laid off and not having access to their email anymore.
After being told that they would get an email.
Yeah.
They were like, okay, we're going to send you an email on the morning of like November 1st, I think it was, or November 2nd, that you'll get an email that'll say whether or not you still have a job. We're going to contact everyone. And then, they try to log into Slack or log into their email account, and they can't. And then it talked about how the remaining people who didn't get laid off, who were still on the Slack workspace, were like just putting the salute emojis to say goodbye and good luck, which is just so nefarious. And I think like what was really interesting is that during meetings and stuff after that, and this just kind of, I guess, I think this is clearly tied with a lot of what we've been talking about, but Musk talked about, of those who would remain have to be like basically the grinders, the people that are willing to put in the work.
Yeah. Well, I also know that later on he sent out because he would do waves of these firings, and I know that later on he sent out an email that was some sort of like loyalty test or something like that. And so I think that just Elon Musk as a CEO and as the previous world's richest man, because I don't think he's the world's richest man anymore.
He's not rich. Take that, Musk.
Yeah, he's not rich at all, obviously.
The only reason he ever got like on those lists is because Tesla is heavily overvalued. Like it's insane. If you look at the share for the other car companies like Toyota and stuff like that, Toyota's like production is massive compared to Tesla. They produce like barely any vehicles in the car industry. It's worth more than like Toyota, like Ford, GM, all these companies combined, which is just doesn't make any sense.
Elon Musk as a CEO and as like one of the billionaires, especially of the United States, is interesting because he kind of operates on like this cult of personality that a lot of the others don't. And like I think part of it for him is he wants to be liked so badly. Like he wants people to like him and respect him. And I think that we see a lot of that in how he's played out the managing of Twitter and who he's kept around, especially as it like got later on in his takeover and as he started like loyalty testing people more and more. And I just think it's very interesting to consider because before this, his cult of personality would have been fine. But after this, even the people who were like neutral or kind of supported him, all of his like bullshit has been spared out into the open and everything. And he can't claim that he's a genius anymore. And he can't claim that like he knows what he's doing.
Well, I mean, that's part of the thing is like, for some reason, or not for some reason, I mean, we know why, like the ideological systems that are supporting this, but we have this like cultural assumption that people that are successful are brilliant enough to have earned that success.
Yeah.
And not recognizing it as the lottery that it is, or just the game of nepotism that we play. There's moral and intellectual and work ethic attributions that are applied to this of, well, he's one of the biggest billionaires, something's going right with him, like he must be brilliant, he must be smart. And then it's like, put yourself in this position on this platform to air out everything for the world, and people begin to see that that's not the case, and it's like, wait, what? I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I didn't read it because, New York Times, but at the end they had about how like Elon Musk just generally isn't good at running companies. And this one was specifically about Tesla and his mismanagement of Tesla. And like, it's kind of interesting actually, because there is a lot of reports I've seen about like Tesla failing to meet their very small and modest production quotas. But the quote I was looking for earlier, I found it from the New York Times. They say, Mr. Musk added that they would need to work strenuously to keep the company afloat. This was the remaining employees at Twitter who weren't laid off. And he said, quote, those who are able to go hardcore and play to win, Twitter is a good place. And those who are not, totally understand, but then Twitter is not for you. And they also put this point about, there was this one employee who was, let's see if I can find her quickly. But she was
the sleeping one.
Yeah, the sleeping one.
Having read this article, I still don't know who the sleeping one is. So I'm like, ooh, do tell. The sleeping employee.
She was a product manager at Twitter who was like, and she, after Elon Musk, should we just call him Elon? I think that's taking away a little bit of the respect. But Elon came in. She was elevated in her position and given more responsibilities and more work. And her response was to post a picture of herself sleeping on the floor in Twitter's San Francisco headquarters in a sleeping bag and an eye mask with the hashtag sleep where you work. And New York Times say her message rubbed some colleagues the wrong way. They wondered in private chats why they should commit long working hours to a man who could fire them. And Ms. Crawford responded on Twitter to what she called the hecklers by saying that she had received supportive messages from other entrepreneurs and builders of all types, which is like strikes, like it rings so many alarm bells for me, like talking about entrepreneurs and builders. But
this is like that like hustler culture mindset, right?
Exactly.
Of like,
yeah,
do whatever it takes to get where you need, and if that equals sleeping at work, that means sleeping at work. And as I'm sure we know, that's like fucked.
At the same time, though, complexity here is really interesting just because the quote unquote hecklers are saying, like, why would you want to do this for someone who could fire you at any point? Because Elon Musk has demonstrated that he would do so. And yet that's what we all do at the base of it. All the work we do is for people that could fire us at any point.
Yeah.
And likely would. And I mean, that's been the reality for a lot of people, especially those with marginalized experiences that have been discriminated based on race or sex or gender identity and so on. So I guess it's just a little bit of irony of like, this is not a very extreme, but an extreme example. But at the same time, it's what we're all doing. We just don't recognize it in these terms.
It's what we're doing right now. Well, at least me, staying up till 12:51 a.m. for our podcast to get ahead. Woo!
We're being entrepreneurs here.
Like, we are, yeah. All of us, yeah. grind culture. Hashtag sleep where you work.
Me in my bed.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Welcome to my home office. But I think that's a really good point, because I was just thinking earlier when you were talking about your experiences at FedEx and Starbucks, like my experience as the person that bags your groceries when I was 16 years old, my whole mindset was, okay, I want my bosses to like me. I want to come off as a good worker. And I was just like terrified of showing up late, of doing something wrong where they would be like, this guy's about, and I was like, this is gonna follow me for the rest of my life if I'm not, like, I lose my first job, or like they, put something on my file or something. So I think it's like
Yeah.
insidious how early they get you too. It's just,
It's as if we're born in this capitalist system
oh my gosh,
that is
imagine.
fundamentally built to exploit us, to take away our human dignity.
Yeah. Well, because like I also think too that sometimes the workplaces that are like, we're like a family, are the most insidious. I just think, especially with some of these like companies that are seen as like progressive or like liberal, some of them are terrible with their like labor practices and their violations. We're taught from like a young age, especially within our first jobs, because those are the first jobs people are getting, that like that's how it's supposed to be, and like this is okay.
Yeah, and going off with the whole Elon Musk and Twitter thing, like after the 3,738 layoffs, or however much it ended up being, there's lots of concerns from employees within Twitter that they would even be able to keep running the site, whether the engineers were worried about keeping it up. It slowly happened, that similar to the kind of expectations that Elon laid out about how much the Twitter employees would have to work. Many of the people in executive positions who hadn't been laid off just decided to quit because it would be too much work. They would have to put in too long of hours to actually do the necessary tasks that they would need to do, because they literally just lost half their workforce. And that led to more problems, which there was many positions in which many aspects of Twitter and profit-driven aspects of Twitter at Goldberg, Twitter's revenue division, the company had to bring back those who ran key money-generating products that no one else knows how to operate, people with knowledge of the business end. One manager agreed to try rehiring some laid-off workers, but expressed concerns that they were weak, lazy, unmotivated, and they may even be against an Elon Twitter. So I just think this is literally like, I don't know if you've heard of the subreddit, like leopards eating my face. It's just like you being like this close to being self-aware, but just completely missing the point. It's like showing the incompetence of Elon to say, okay, we're going to have to lay off all these people in such a short period of time, but not actually assess what are the necessary people, and screw up and have to ask people to come back. And then the fact that this other person says, we shouldn't call these people back because they were laid off for a reason. So I was just like, that just blew my mind.
And I mean, like, there's even more to it than that, where you're losing people, or in Twitter's case, firing them, and then you don't recognize the value to the company that they bring. But if you've got someone doing their job, you're not usually grateful for it. You don't recognize what you have till you don't have it, kind of thing, you know? And one of the things about that manager's quote that I want to go off of, which the New York Times didn't cite this part of the quote, but like in the messages, he said, "This is going to be a challenge. The engineers I'm bringing back are weak, lazy, unmotivated, and they may even be against an Elon Twitter." And then another message below that said, "They were cut for a reason. So we need to think of these people as just needing to be around until the knowledge transition is completed." So you're like bringing people back just long enough for them to teach other people what they know, and then firing them again. And this knowledge transition period is one of the crucial aspects of, what's going on, that companies don't have control over, and employees as a workforce, we're not pulling the leverages of power that we need to. I mean, thinking of the quote unquote Great Resignation that's been going on for the past couple years, it has the bones of a social movement. Like, we could actually be doing some real activist social justice work and fighting for livable wages that aren't going to just like be dissolved by inflation, and then all the other ways that companies compensate for increasing wages. So like you increase workers' wages, but then you increase prices, and then the consumers have to pay more. And then, it basically just obfuscates like the struggle that's going on. But if there was a concerted effort like around this Great Resignation, where it's like, okay, we recognize as a collective workforce that if we don't get the benefits we need, then we're going to take this wave of resignation and we're going to not work at these companies. Then companies are actually going to have to get strategic about addressing the issues. But right now it's just like every person fending for themselves, and there is no concerted effort. It's just this struggle and conflict that I'm kind of a little invested in. Is just like, this is a real opportunity for a labor movement to make actual change if there was some effort to devote attention and investment into this. But there isn't any kind of concerted effort or body that has the traction to be doing this at a large scale. And all of us just running amok on our own isn't solving the systemic problems that need to be going on. Going back to this quote from the boss at Twitter, like, this is just like encapsulating the precariousness of these positions and the ways that we're not pulling the levers of power that we could be. And it's going to bite us in the butt if we don't actually start doing some of this, because this succinctly captures how disposable management and upper levels of companies often consider staff and employees to be.
Yeah, just imagine. It's just what I'm thinking while you're talking is UBI, universal basic income. It's not a silver bullet solution. I think there's no silver bullet solutions, because hundreds of years ago, it was always mechanization. It's going to solve our problems because people will have to work less, and then we can pay people more for the work they do. And of course, that led the other way with robots replacing machines and people not, or robots replacing machines.
That'll be the
day. Back in my day, we had robots replacing people. Now we have robots replacing machines. Yes, robots replacing people, taking away employment opportunities from people. So watch out for the robots.
Thinking of that kind of thing, there's also this mentality. It's not necessarily the American dream, but like the pull yourself up by your bootstrap, like frontier, rugged masculinity, like American military whole thing. But just this idea that working is not only good for you, but like, especially if we're looking at historically slave labor and like the exploitation of immigrant populations and like indigenous communities, it was seen based on like the white people in power, like forcing people to do hard labor was a way to kind of compensate for their inferiority as humans. Like, it was almost a cure for the fact that you're Black or Native American or something. Like, these kinds of ideas of work being a source of refinement or cure or like making people whole or better humans, like this stuff is baked into our culture. And UBI, universal basic income, would be amazing, but at the same time, like those kinds of ideological structures that are in place, like, that's just going to cause more problems without holistically addressing like the entire ideological system in which we're operating.
Right. Yeah. I think like for me, it just is perhaps the most promising, like kind of wide scale, sort of holistic or sort of like powerful people are sort of advocating for it, like Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang, that could have the kind of strong effect that we're looking for, that goes even beyond people working who are in unions or who are not in unions. Like, it would apply to
everyone. Yeah, definitely. So, not say that I think it's a bad idea. Yeah. Why would it be a bad idea for someone to be able to pay for food and water and shelter and safety?
Yeah, that's just the value I see of it. But yeah, on behalf of all of us from Unlivable Cultures, thank you for tuning in to our episode about unions, labor, Twitter, Starbucks, all of our grind culture that we immerse ourselves in. So yes, thank you for listening. We hope you check out our other episodes, because this is the place where we work, where we sleep. And with that, signing off. Bye.